Hi, my fellow Scriabinoids. Today we're going to talk about what actually is interpretation. I love to talk about this subject and to discuss what can be a musical interpretation or a cross-disciplinary interpretation when there are several artistic genres involved, but let's take one step at a time. Of course, all the references I am using are linked in the description box, so you can browse the literature I am mentioning, and let me know in the comments if you agree or disagree, or maybe you have found something else that is very interesting, and I would love to know. When a performing artist interprets a work, they present their own transient version of it. A version implies a change, whether it is viewed as a distortion with a negative connotation or a recreation, a positive one then. Since there is no possibility for a human being to interpret the work identically twice even when it is performed by the composer themselves. According to Theodor Adorno, true interpretation consists not in the perspectival observation of a work that is given once and for all. Rather, the work itself incorporates the dialectic of its observation and thus grants it objectivity through change. So he already implies that the change is the core of interpretation. And honestly, I love this quote. A musical interpretation consists, of course, of several aspects, among which are quality, precision, rationality, logic, sensibility, taste, and tradition or style. All of these are subjectively evaluated using one's personal judgment. In classical music, the score provides a set of guidelines, even if very strict. However, it may not prescribe exactly how the performance should unfold in time. One works with the potential of the score in order to find the specifics in every single section of each work. According to John Rink, the score is not the music, nor is the music confined to the score. So the objective approach to the interpretation cannot be fully achieved due to every individual's unique set of previous experiences, background, education, attitude, and values, both artistic and personal. Adorno states, however, that objectivity of insight and representation does not demand a decrease in subjectivity, an abandonment thereof, but rather an increase in subjectivity. The subjective component of objectivity is interpretation. I will now take a slight detour and say that this provides a crucial perspective, especially in the context of a cross-disciplinary approach, as it technically involves more than one interpretation occurring simultaneously, or rather a multi-layered intermediate interpretation of a work from the perspective and by using the possibilities of several artistic genres. I'm talking about performances when there are several genres blended and every artist has been given some amount of freedom of how to execute a certain work, a certain performance via their artistic medium. Now, if I take Alexandre Scriabin as an example, during the middle and late periods of his legacy, he notates character indications in a highly sophisticated manner. However, the precision of the execution is left, of course, entirely to the performer, as he does not specify the degree, the manner, and the actual means to implement his remarks. For example, avec une chaleur contenue with the continuous heat, or mystérieusement sonore, mysteriously sonorous, légendaire, legendary. How do you play legendary, right? In regard to interpreting his score, Anatole Leikin claims that at the time, no one was supposed to slavishly follow the printed score and play it metronomically steady, with all the rhythms carried out exactly as written. Scriabin also often staggers the notes that are supposed to be played simultaneously while continuously flexing the tempo. Freely arpeggiated chords can also be considered a form of desynchronization, a practice that clarifies contrapunctal lines and intensifies the impression of improvisatory freedom, or possibly rhythmic displacements help overcome the stringency of the beat, minimizing its authority and thus increasing the overall fluidity of musical motion. For a modern listener, the piano roll recordings of Alexandre Scriabin playing his own works can be surprisingly different from how his music is generally played more than a century later, and I'm linking a playlist where Scriabin plays Scriabin below in the description, as well as up here. Nicholas Cook writes that Scriabin's rolls exhibit equally diversified treatment of the literal repetitions characteristic of his compositional style. Additionally, Leikin compares the two types of piano rolls, the Hupfeld and Velte Mignon. Many important ingredients of Scriabin's performing style are faithfully reflected in the transcriptions of his recordings, such as tempo fluctuations, desynchronization of the parts, articulation, and to an extent pedaling and dynamics. The Velte rolls are definitely more valuable in this regard than the Hupfeld rolls. The former are much less edited and therefore closer to Scriabin's original performances, though the latter also contain many fascinating details. These rolls certainly offer a far richer picture of his style than the printed page alone can convey. Scriabin's daughter, Marina Scriabin, emphasized that around an apparently uniform rhythmic scheme, he succeeded in creating rhythmic designs of extreme subtlety, irrational polyphonies, whose capricious palpitation played with meter without either betraying it or becoming its slave. A testimony drawn from family recollections and studio reports rather than direct memory that highlights how far his rubato and micro-timing depart from later literalist norms. Together, these sources highlight how much of Scriabin's interpretive nuance, rubato, voicing, pedaling, and timing never reached the printed score and must be rediscovered by today's performers via their own individual approach to interpretation. In order to understand a piano performance, I have placed components and features of interpretation into the two main categories, the temporal and the temporal, each having their own subcategories respectively, although some of them do overlap due to sharing the qualities rather homogeneously. The phenomena occurring and observed during a pianistic interpretation can be categorized and subcategorized by using this diagram. Certainly, a solo interpretation is more than the sum of its parts. It has a possibility to create a genuine personal imprint on a potential listener and even on the musician themselves, if presented from a frame of a thorough preparation and a deep emotional involvement combined together. A cross-disciplinary interpretation, of course, expands the horizons, the possibilities, and oftentimes might even justify certain, let's say, unpredictable dynamic and temporal fluctuations from the score as a necessity in a particular scenario, as a logical and valid choice. However, no interpretation may exist without the concept of subjectivity and of the change itself. While Theodor Adorno claims that the work and the interpretation need each other, I pose a question whether the work does yet exist fully from a particular viewpoint of a performer if presented only in the form of a score. Respectively, I am convinced that interpretation serves as a recreation of a work, whether being performed musically by the means of a score alone or by taking it further, actually, into an intermediate setting, thus by involving multiple interpretational layers and interweaving these with the help of intersubjective responsiveness. And now I would like to touch up on the modes of listening, because we all listen to the music. We're all present in a various state of presence or a various form of the listening engagement. In my exploration of Alexandre Scriabin's works through my own research, And the time I have spent with these pieces, I have noticed that my interpretational choices often stem from distinct modes of listening. That is, particular ways of perceiving and engaging with the music. These modes sometimes interact fluidly and at other times create tensions, maybe, that prompt deeper artistic reflection. I'm going to reference a few examples in a minute, but I would also like to introduce the concepts in a broader sense to outline how they shape or they might shape one's understanding of music or one's engagement with the music, and particularly how one responds to harmony, structure, and expressive content. In my own artistic process, these modes of listening often interplay, sometimes enriching each other and at other times challenging me to reconcile different perspectives. Although I address formal and harmonic elements, I find myself more drawn to interpretations that emphasize dramatic characters, symbolic or mystical components, and a heightened emotional resonance. In many works, especially with characters indicated in the title, such as Masque, Fragilité, Énigme, or Étrangeté, I naturally engage with Scriabin's music as a form of narrative or even character drama, where musical gestures might even take on the role of protagonist or antagonist in a play. For example, I frequently perceive certain melodic lines as if they were separate, sometimes even conflicting voices or personalities. This narrative-like approach heightens the tension between contrasting themes, allowing me to portray moments of conflict, merging, and transformation as though they were scenes in a larger story. Particularly in Sonata No. 9, The Black Mass, I have identified opposing character lines, one murmuring and mysterious. Another treacherous. Consequently, when a motif raises the kind of sound symbol resonance that Langage describes, I catch it through what Norman calls a referential mode of listening, hearing the passage as pointing outward to images, places, or myths, and letting those associations steer my interpretive choices. Hearing the music in this way fuels my interpretational decisions in regard to phrasing, articulation, rubato, and dynamics, as I aim to convey the interplay of distinct characters interacting with a single musical form. In Scriabin's writing, I also sense a spiritual quality rooted in his theosophical outlook and desire to elevate the listener beyond ordinary human emotion. This is what I refer to as spiritual listening. I hear some sections as doorways to a transcendent space, an experience akin to a transformative insight. For example, in Vers la Flamme, Towards the Flame, or Sonata No. 10, or the introduction of Sonata No. 9. When approaching these passages, I intentionally adopt a more meditative, inward focus, minimizing overt displays of rubato or emotional tumult to preserve a feeling of cosmic stillness. In this mode, I become acutely aware of how color, of the light, the movement, and even scent might foster an atmosphere that feels otherworldly. This mindset frames my interpretational choices so that I treat certain climaxes less as theatrical showstoppers and more as points of heightened internal awareness. A further dimension of my listening involves hearing Scriabin's music as a dreamlike or emotional experience, a suspended state where harmonic shifts and sonic textures evoke altered consciousness or surreal imagery. I have found that when performing, A dream-based mode of listening softens my sense of linear progression and invites me to actually linger on unusual harmonies or fleeting gestures. It also overlaps with what I would call emotional education, in that my own emotional and imaginative reactions become a vital source of interpretive insight, for example in Rêverie, Danse languide or Sonata No. 8. I learn about the piece and about my own artistry by acknowledging the dreamlike sensations and subtle expressive nuances that arise when I play. This approach can be, of course, shared with collaborators who in turn bring their own affective landscapes to the work. Although I do pay attention to formal structures, theoretical and harmonic analysis, I rarely find myself relying solely on a purely abstract or formalist mode of listening, although it also exists naturally. Instead, I notice that I consistently layer my interpretations with narratives, symbolic gestures, and the potential for transcendence-like experiences, at least to a certain extent. This does not mean that I neglect harmonic analysis. Rather, I prefer to integrate form and harmony within a broader expressive framework. By combining form-based insights with more dramatic, spiritual, and dreamlike approaches, I believe that it's possible to reach a deeper synthesis that respects the score's intricacies while emphasizing the music's emotional and imaginative power. Overall, these modes of listening guide both my own solitary practice and collaborative sessions, shaping the way I invite other artists and ultimately the audience to experience Scriabin's works. So by reflecting on these modes, you can sharpen their awareness of how you engage with each piece, whether as a listener or as a performer, seeking interpretational consistency while remaining open to new layers of meaning. Let me know in the comments whether you have ever thought about modes of listening, or maybe you could add another mode of listening or several that I was not mentioning in this video. It would be so amazing to exchange, and I hope that this video has shed some light onto how interpretation can be approached, as well as the modes of listening in which we perceive or create interpretation as artists, as musicians. First of all, if this was helpful in any way or useful or informative, don't forget to hit a like and subscribe. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye.